Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode, the first episode for 2022 of the ongoing series Stark at Home. My usual first question, can you hear me? Can someone type in the chat? Can you see both Dan and myself? Dan says that he can, but I just want to make sure that, the gods of the internet are also working. Shalom, Shoemaker. Can you hear us? Can someone confirm? Okay, very good. So this is yet another episode of Stark at Home with no other than the great Professor Dan Bonnet from Stanford University. So for those who don't know, Dan is a co-inventor of pairing-based cryptography. He's going to tell us a little bit about that, which is one of the most important innovative ideas and approaches to a lot of things in cryptography, starting with identity-based encryption and other cool things, three-way key exchange, and all the way to pre-processing ZK snarks, which is one of the reasons we have him here. Dan, it's really great to have you. I'll just I won't go over all of the things that and awards that Dan received, but he is a fellow of the American Mathematical Society as of last year. He received the Gödel Award and an RSA Award and a bunch of other things, and is really among the founding fathers of the subfield of pairing-based cryptography. Dan, a great honor to have you here with us.
Yeah, Ellie, it's great. Thank you for inviting me. Looking forward to a wonderful hour.
Thank you. So to those listeners who for them it's the first time, or for those who it's been a while since they've been here, we'll go through some discussion and questions and answers. Mostly Dan will be talking. If you have a question you want to ask, please use the Ask a Question button that I'm now going to use. So like, what's 1 + 1? That's an example for a question. Please use this button so we can record it. The chat is very hard to track. So, okay. Without further ado, Dan, can you please tell us the amazing story of pairing-based cryptography all the way from its invention to snarks?
Oh, yeah. I think, Ellie, you actually asked me to start a little bit earlier. I guess we'll start with elliptic curve crypto. But maybe actually before that, I do have one announcement and one story to share. So you know that every year we've been running this Science of Blockchain conference. And so this year, unfortunately, last year we couldn't do it because of the pandemic. And this year we had to, we were planning to run it in January, but again, because of what's happening, we had to unfortunately postpone it to August. So the conference will take place. It's at Stanford in August, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody there. So just keep in mind it's postponed from January to August. So Ellie, maybe before I start, maybe there's a story that I like to tell folks. So why don't I start with that? So a couple of months ago, maybe it was a year or two ago, I got a call from a reporter who asked me to tell them a little bit about what I work on, and they said, you're a cryptographer. What is it that you work on? And I said, yeah, I'm a cryptographer. I've been doing it a long time. So they asked, how long have you been working on crypto? And I said, well, it's almost it's hard to believe it, but it's almost like 30 years that I've been working on crypto research. And so the reporter was a little puzzled. And so I asked, well, why are you puzzled? And they said, well, before 2009, there was no crypto. So what did you work on before 2009? So that confused me a little bit. And I had to explain, no, there was actually cryptography way before 2009, before Satoshi Nakamoto. And in fact, it's a thriving field, dates back to Babylonian times and so on. But that question actually made me think a little bit about is there something new about blockchain cryptography in particular? And I think it's kind of interesting that traditional cryptography, like what we would call internet cryptography, like cryptography that's used on the internet, is primarily focused on confidentiality, right? How do I send my credit card number over to a remote site so that no one can read my credit card number in the network? So it's primarily focused on confidentiality, where it's very interesting that in the blockchain space, confidentiality actually is not that important. Encryption doesn't play such an important role. And in the blockchain space, cryptography is primarily used for things like data integrity, right? So commitments are very important, signatures are very important, SNARKs are very important. None of those things really have to do with kind of the traditional encryption, decryption aspects of confidentiality of cryptography, which I thought was pretty interesting. That in fact, it looks like blockchains are kind of using a different type of cryptography than what's traditionally being used on the internet. Yeah, and you see that's also in our blockchain courses, where we primarily focus on data integrity and not so much on confidentiality. So let's see, that was like a quick background. Now, Ellie, you asked me to talk a little bit about kind of how we got to where we are, and I think you wanted me to talk a little bit about elliptic curve crypto and how that got started and all that. So I think it's actually an amazing story. Elliptic curve crypto is really, I think, one of the successes of modern mathematics. So if you think about where elliptic curves in general, where they come from, actually, it dates back to the days of Diophantus, right? So Diophantus is a Greek mathematician. He lived in between 200 and 300 AD. He worked in Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria. And it's really quite interesting if you look at his works. Most of his works deal with what we call quadratic curves, which are kind of not so much interesting for us these days. But then a few of his problems that he looked at actually have to do with cubic curves. And in particular, if you look at he wrote a whole bunch of books. If you look at one of his cubic problems, I think it's on book 4 or something like that. He asks kind of an interesting question. He asks, the Greeks didn't quite know how to write math, right? But so he writes the question in a pretty strange way. But if you translate it to modern terms, what he's actually asking is to find a rational point on a very simple curve. The curve is y squared equals x cubed minus x plus 9. Yeah, y squared equals x cubed minus x plus 9. Yeah, he's asking to find basically rational points, so x and y being rational, that satisfy this equation. Now, if you think about this equation for just a minute, you realize there are very easy points on this curve. There are some integer points. For example, 1 comma 3 is a point. Again, y squared equals x cubed minus x plus 9. So the point 1 comma 3 is a point in this curve. The point 0 comma 3 is a point in this curve. And he wanted to find more points in this curve. And he came up with this really, really cute idea, which says that if you connect the 2 points, so I give you 2 integer points that are very easy on the curve. If you connect those 2 points by a line, then the third point, then there has to be, that line has to intersect the cubic, this cubic curve at a third point. You know that a line intersects a cubic always at 3 points. We have 2 integer points. And it's very easy to show that if you have 2 integer points on a line that intersects the cubic, the third intersection point also has to be a rational point. Yeah, so that was Diophantus' idea back in 200 AD, and that allowed him to compute more points on this curve. Interestingly, he was only interested in finding one more point, so he just did this calculation, found one more point, and declared success, and that was it. But of course, we're interested in finding many rational points on this curve, and so the idea was, if you have 2 points, you can pass a line through those 2 points. And because it's a cubic, there has to be a third intersection point. And it's, again, easy to see that if 2 of the intersection points are rational, the third intersection point also has to be rational. So this idea, interestingly, was discovered 1,700 years ago. What's interesting is it was done for no reason at all. It had no application at all. It's just this guy, Diophantus, was just curious about this. Yeah, and I think, again, this is kind of a remarkable example of how curiosity that has no application to anything at all, at the end of the day, it turns out to be the most practical thing on the internet, right? So if anybody tells you in the future, why are you working on this thing? This has no applications. You should always remind them 1,700 years ago, this guy did something that had no applications at all. Just because he was curious, it took 1,700 years, but eventually it found an amazing application, and it now powers all the cryptography on the internet and on blockchains. So this idea kind of basically went on and on and on. It was apparently rediscovered many, many, many times throughout the ages, until finally in 1901, actually Poincaré kind of did his seminal work on curves, and that's when it was recognized that this idea of passing a line through 2 points and getting a third point, not only does it give you new rational points, it actually has a group structure. Yeah, and that's where the elliptic curve group comes from. And in Poincaré, in his work, he set up a whole bunch of open questions in this space. Some of them have been answered, some of them have not been answered. Maybe I should say, if the folks in the audience are interested in kind of reading a little bit about the history of this, there's this really short, wonderful book. It's a book by Bashmakova from 1997 that actually gives the history of all the way back from Diophantus, kind of recasts Diophantus's work in modern language. It's really quite interesting to see how those techniques actually translate to the 20th century. So anyhow, as you know, elliptic curves sort of gave us a group where the discrete log problem is very hard. And because it's a group where discrete log is hard, we can use it to do Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Yeah, so now once we have Diffie-Hellman key exchange, we have El-Gamal encryption, and that's exactly what actually powers this on the internet. Yeah, somebody's asking, what's this book called? I'll say the author name is Bashmakova. Yeah, it's translated from Russian. It's a really, really cute book. Bashmakova. Yeah, you got it. And so, right. So once we have a group, we can ask how hard is discrete log. This is when we look at the group over a finite field, we get a finite group. Turns out to have a very difficult discrete log as far as we know. So that's actually kind of where the applications to cryptography come from. So this dates back to like the mid 1980s, Victor Miller and Neil Koblitz, and kind of elliptic curve cryptography took off from there, right? So we can do things on curves and run basically key exchange and public key encryption on curves. So that's like why this stuff is so useful on the internet today. Now, the amazing thing is actually that these elliptic curves, it's not just that they're only a group that has a hard discrete log, which is kind of why we were primarily interested in them. It turns out, magically, these elliptic curves actually have additional structure beyond just the fact that it's a cyclic group with a hard discrete log. So this additional structure is what's called a pairing. And I think the history of the pairing is also really, really interesting. So the pairing was actually first discovered by André Weil, who's actually one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century. This was in his work that was done he published in 1949. It's a very, very famous work in mathematics. And as part of that work, he actually defines a pairing on elliptic curves. Now, again, if you want there's a cute story about that work in that they had to live through World War II. And if you read his autobiography, it's actually quite interesting. He describes his life during World War II, and it's like nothing like describes the chaos that Europe went through during World War II. It's quite interesting to read. But he was actually French, and he was what he defines himself as a conscientious objector. So he refused to join the military, and as a result, he actually had to spend time in prison. He was thrown into prison for like 3 months. Somewhere in France. And he says, it's kind of funny, actually, in his autobiography, he says, basically for 3 months, he was confined to a prison cell. They had to give him pen and paper, where he, that's apparently the law, and where he could just write. And he had nothing else to do. So he says this was like the most productive period of his life. All of his work, all of his greatest works, basically were done during those 3 months, to the point where he says that he was going to write a letter. Actually, he wrote a letter to his wife where he says, I was going to write a letter to the head of the French Mathematical Society to recommend that every mathematician spend some time in jail just so they can launch their career. Yeah, I don't know what that would be, photographers. But for him, it was a very, very productive time. And one of the things that he did while he was in this jail is come up with this idea for pairing on elliptic curves. Yeah, so it's this additional structure beyond just the fact that it's a group. And the remarkable thing, I have to say, it's really a little surprising. If you look at the definition of the pairing that Weil gave, he actually did extra work to make the pairing as concrete as possible. Yeah, so he gave a very concrete definition. If you look at later works on pairings, for example, you can look at Shimura's book. Shimura gives kind of a more abstract definition for which it's easier to prove the properties, but it's not computable. Yeah, that definition is not computable. So, like from a mathematician's point of view, who doesn't care about computability, there's an easier definition than what Weil give that actually mathematicians tend to use these days of the pairing. But somehow Weil did extra work to give a very concrete definition. And actually in 1986, Victor Miller showed that Weil's definition actually is computable. He gave an efficient algorithm to compute the pairing. This is now the famous Miller algorithm for computing pairings. So this is actually a fantastic piece of work. And again, I think it's a remarkable story. So Victor Miller wrote his algorithm for computing the pairing in 1986. He tried to publish it in Stock and Fox, and the response from the reviewers were the paper is rejected because it has no applications. Yeah, this is kind of a theme, as you can see throughout this talk. Things that look like they have no applications today, you can never tell, because it's very likely that they'll have applications in the future. So it's kind of remarkable. This amazing paper that showed how to compute the pairing was unpublished. Yeah, for many, many years, it was unpublished. But people in the know actually knew that the pairing is actually computable. There's this Miller algorithm for computing the pairing, and the first application of the pairing by Menezes and Vanstone was actually to attack discrete log systems. Yeah, so they actually showed that certain elliptic curves have a relatively easy discrete log problem. Yeah, so that was kind of the first cryptographic application for the Vey pairing. But it took actually many years, I have to say, until Victor Miller's paper was published. Finally, when pairing-based crypto took off, the paper was published in the Journal of Cryptology as sort of an archival version of the paper, but that was not until 2004. Again, it's kind of mind-boggling. No, that's such a classic paper was rejected and not published because it had no applications until 2004. So I think it's a good lesson for all of us. We should kind of follow. If we think something is interesting, we should work on it, and applications will be discovered whenever they're discovered. So then basically the story continues that the pairing has turned out to be much more useful than just for attacking discrete log. It turns out there are tons of cryptographic applications that it's good for. I was fortunate to be one of the people who kind of discovered some of the applications, but there's a large crowd of people who worked on pairings. So maybe I could just kind of give some of the applications that the pairing has found in crypto, and then we can kind of focus on SNARKs. So let's see. So the pairing has been used for a lot of different types of signature schemes. So BLS signatures, for example, are very simple signature schemes that come from pairings. They have aggregation properties, which means that if I give you many different signatures on many different messages by many different people, you can take all those signatures and compress them into just a single signature that might even be quite easy to verify. Yeah, so those are BLS signatures. I do want to mention that there is another type of signature called a BB signature. This is due to myself and Xavier Boyen, which is a little different from BLS. It doesn't have the aggregation properties of BLS. The interesting thing about BB signatures is that you can sign messages without actually having to use an additional hash function. Yeah, so if you need signatures that maybe are easy to verify in zero knowledge, BB signatures might be amenable because they don't require additional hash functions in the signature itself. At least for short messages, you can sign without hashing. They've been used for group signatures, for ring signatures. These are various privacy mechanisms that we actually haven't quite seen group signatures used widely on blockchains, but like we said, I'm sure it's just a matter of time before applications for group signatures are also discovered. So that's in the context of signatures. Yeah, many new signature schemes were discovered with new properties and new capabilities. In the area of encryption, pairings have found tremendous applications like identity-based encryption, broadcast encryption, searchable encryption, attribute-based encryption. These are all sorts of new encryption schemes that were much harder to build without pairings, and pairings kind of just made them very easy, very practical. Particularly, honestly, I really like broadcast encryption in that it's kind of probably good for people to know. Broadcast encryption is a way to send an encrypted message to a subset of a large population. So rather than encrypting the message individually over and over again to every recipient, so that the ciphertext size would be linear in the number of recipients, broadcast encryption allows you to encrypt a message in a way that the ciphertext size is sort of independent of the number of recipients. And somebody's asking about pairings for homomorphic encryption. So yes, in fact, I'm glad you asked. In fact, there are applications of pairings to homomorphic encryption. You can actually build This is called a BGN system, where you can build a pairing-based system that allows you to do arbitrary additions on ciphertexts and one multiplication. Yeah, the multiplication is done using a pairing. So if you think about that, that means that if you need to do quadratic operations on ciphertext, you can do that quite easily using a pairing, right? Because the pairing would allow you to do arbitrary additions and one multiplication. That amounts to basically a quadratic function. So you can evaluate quadratic functions on ciphertext quite easily using this BGN crypto system. Yeah, so it's good to keep in mind. Of course, these days we can do many more homomorphic operations. We can do many more multiplications using lattices instead of pairings. Yeah, so some folks are asking about links to broadcast encryption. It's actually quite easy. If you look at, if you just Google broadcast encryption, you'll find a whole bunch of works on this. There are actually quite a few. Maybe like there's works of myself and Brent Waters that actually give fairly good broadcast encryptions from pairings, and there's been a lot of work on this since then as well. In fact, even last year, there's beautiful work by Hote Kui on broadcast encryption from pairings. So yeah, there's lots of references online to do that. So that kind of brings us up to speed. Yeah, this is kind of the history of elliptic curves and pairings and how they work. And then the killer application, of course, for pairings is SNARKs. Yeah,
that's the way. Before we go to SNARKs, I just want to ask, what's your mental image like when you think about elliptic curves and pairings? Do you have how do you view them, like internally? How do you describe them informally to yourself?
Oh, I see. I kind of left it as at a high level as a pairing is just an additional structure on a curve. But you're asking what actually is it, right?
Well, more like probably that's hard to define, but more like how informally do you think of it, or do you suggest it without actually giving the math definition, which is, how do you think of it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think the way to like an easy way to explain like why pairings are so powerful is really they allow us to do inner products on committed data. Yeah, so if you think about this, think of having two vectors. Let's call them A1 to AN and B1 to BN. These are two vectors. And really what a pairing does is it gives us a way to maybe commit to A1 to AN in the exponents. So I can give you G to the power of A1, or let's use additive notation. I can give you A1 times a point P, A2 times a point P up to AN times a point P. Same thing for B1 to BN. So we commit to these two vectors in the exponent. Yeah, so you're given sort of hidden versions of these two vectors. And even though you have no idea what the vectors are, a pairing, what it allows you to do is to compute the inner product of these two vectors. Yeah, and it turns out all the magic basically comes from that. Just the fact that you can kind of homomorphically compute inner products on committed data very efficiently using a pairing, that basically is kind of where all the magic is. Maybe an easy way to think about this is just think about the exponential function. So the exponential function, generally, given g to the x and g to the y, if I multiply g to the x times g to the y, I get g to the x plus y. So doing additions in the exponents is really quite easy, just by multiplying the two group elements that I gave you. And what a pairing does is basically it allows you to do one more thing. It allows you to pair those two group elements. And given g to the x and g to the y, you can compute g to the x, or roughly something related to g to the x times y. So it kind of allows you to do a multiplication in the exponent, but only one multiplication because you move to a different group. So that's kind of very concretely what a pairing does, just kind of a multiplication in the exponent. But more generally, I have to say, if you just generalize this, you can generalize this to an inner product of two vectors that are given to you in the exponent. Yeah, and that's kind of where all the power comes from. That's why all these kind of new amazing applications are possible thanks to pairing.
Okay, so I paused to interrupt you just to ask about how do you view pairings, but you wanted to say a little bit like on this amazing application of pairings to ZK snarks. So
Oh yeah, actually, absolutely. Maybe actually before we go to snarks, there's actually a lot to say about snarks. Obviously, that's one of my favorite areas. Eli, I'm sure it's one of your favorite areas too.
yeah,
it's kind of again a beautiful development that's happened in the last couple of years. But maybe before we go to snarks, there's one more comment that I'd like to make, which is, there's this huge open problem in crypto that we could really use more help on, which is that, how we said that a pairing allows you to do one multiplication in the exponent, right? Given g to the x and g to the y, you can compute something like g to the x times y. Well, what we'd like to do is more than just one multiplication. We'd like to do many multiplications. Yeah, and this is actually what's called a multilinear map. Yeah, so a pairing really is what we would call a bilinear map. Yeah, it allows you to compute on pairs. It's a bilinear map, and what we'd like to have is a multilinear map. So concretely, for those of you who understand the terminology, I'll just say very quickly, we'd like to have a group where the discrete log problem in the group is hard, and yet if I give you g to the power of x1, g to the power of x2, up to g to the power of xn, there's sort of a multilinear operation on this n tuple that would give us something like g to the power of x1 times x2 up to xn. Yeah, turns out if we had a multilinear map, then lots and lots of things become an efficient multilinear map. Lots of things become possible. Frankly, I personally believe these things are doable. We just haven't found them yet. Yeah, but it's been open now for almost 15 years, and no, we have not been able to construct very good ones. We have some candidates, but not very good ones. And so this is still a big open problem. Hopefully, somebody listening can help us out and discover this. Because if we could have good multilinear maps, I guess we'll get to the applications in a minute. But then we have like really, really cool things that we can do.
Yeah. So do you want to say? So at some point we'll take questions, but maybe you want to talk a little bit about like, pairings and ZK snarks, a match made in heaven.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. So right. I imagine you kind of covered some of these topics maybe in your previous at home series, but it turns out that pairings are really.
That we have not. The word pairing has not made an appearance.
Oh, wow.
I mean, Starks do it a little bit differently, and they don't revert to a pairing. But so the word pairing has not made an appearance yet.
Yeah. No, makes sense.
Which is why you're here, right? To
right. No, that makes sense. So right. So let's see. So pairings actually turned out to be also extremely useful for snarks. And there's a very long sequence of papers on this. I think there was there's actually quite a lot of work. One of the works that was very influential in the space is a work by Gennaro, Gentry, Parno, and Raykova. It's called the GGPR paper, back from 2012. GGPR. You can find it on ePrint. So I'll say Gennaro, Gentry, Parno, and Raykova. And what they showed is basically that using pairings, we can actually construct snarks where the prover runs in quasi-linear time. Yeah, almost in linear time. I have to that paper actually. It's a beautiful, beautiful paper. It's a little bit difficult to read in that there's a lot of mechanics happening in the paper, and so very shortly after, actually the technique was generalized and kind of presented in a more modular way. Which is also, it's kind of interesting that when you come up with a very complicated idea, it's actually helpful to try and break it into a sequence of steps so that people can kind of follow the steps one at a time to kind of get a better picture of how things work. And so let me also point out this paper that I really like. It's by Bitansky, Chiesa, Ishai, Ostrovsky, and Paneth. It's called the BCIOP paper. And if you search for BCIOP snarks, you'll find it right away. And that paper basically, again, it's from 2012, 2013, kind of abstracts what the GGPR technique is. And it kind of it kind of shows that really the key concept here is what's called a linear PCP. Yeah, it's a, now I don't know the, I need to define what a linear PCP is. Ellie, do you think we should define linear PCPs, or
No.
is that too much?
No.
Okay. All right. So maybe I'll point to that paper, and it's actually a very, very nice, very modular paper to read. So I kind of highly recommend looking through it. It's actually, it's not difficult to read at all. And it defines the concept of a linear PCP, and it shows that basically using pairings, you can actually build these very efficient linear PCPs and what they call linear interactive proofs, and you kind of follow like 5 steps or so, and you end up with a SNARK based on PCPs. So it shows, like, I think that, sorry, a SNARK based on pairings. So it shows very quickly that very clearly that we can actually have SNARKs that are based on very good SNARKs that are based on pairings. Those SNARKs, of course, require a trusted setup. Yeah. So if you guys know the term Tower of Taus, where we have to commit to various powers in the exponent, those kind of constructions do rely on that trusted setup. But then, this kind of opened the floodgates in that there are now there's a huge number of papers on this topic. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Groth 16 paper that gives sort of a optimized version of those proofs. And so kind of Groth 16 is actually really quite a beautiful SNARK, very efficient, very short, very practical. But of course, it does rely on this trusted setup that that's been discussed to death. I think that we have to have this, someone has to generate sort of these parameters, and then the secrets that went into generating the parameters have to be destroyed. Otherwise, someone can prove false statements, and that's a problem. So so what can I say now? I mean, I can survey the world of SNARKs, but now there's like so many works in this area.
Maybe we'll go through the questions that we have.
For sure, yeah.
Okay, so there was one that 1 + 1 = 2. That's okay. We can delete it.
There's already a bunch of questions, I see. Excellent.
Yeah. So first question by Daniel Lopez. Dan, what is your favorite, SNARKs or STARKs? What are the major weaknesses of both?
Oh my God, this is what you're asking me with Ellie on the line. Ellie, you should be answering this. Look, I love both. I love all cryptography. I honestly, to me, the greatest thing about cryptography is that it's this beautiful science that actually is having a real impact in the real world. It has real applications, and people really care about deploying it. I think both, pairing-based SNARKs and hash-based SNARKs, they're beautiful, beautiful techniques. Maybe they are useful for slightly different applications, but both are fantastic, and I'm really, really happy to see both of them being deployed. I mean, the fact that we most likely, in a few years, the roll-up systems that are being deployed now are kind of going to be the main way in which we scale the blockchain. So I'm really excited about these roll-ups. Maybe I should step back for 1 second and talk about I kind of view 3 categories of applications for SNARKs. Yeah, so the 3 categories for applications, the first one is the obvious one, which is scaling, right? So roll-ups and other types of systems. Interestingly, for scaling, we don't really need the zero knowledge property. We just need kind of soundness and actually knowledge soundness of SNARKs, and that's actually STARKs, and that's actually sufficient. So scaling is kind of one wonderful application, and roll-ups are probably going to take over the world. So we'll see. And by the way, when I say roll-ups, I'm including the Validium methods and all that in that as well. The other application is compliance. So you want to prove that you're following the rules. So one of my for that actually you do need zero knowledge, because you want to prove that you're following the rules without revealing what it is you're doing, right? And so one of my favorite applications there is what we call a zero knowledge proof of solvency, right? So like an exchange wants to prove that it hasn't been hacked, and so it wants to prove that it has enough crypto assets to cover its obligations. It can give a zero knowledge proof that actually, if you sum up its obligations to its customers, the result is less than the total assets that the exchange actually has. Yeah, so that actually we know how to do very, very efficiently. Yeah, but we have tried now for a long time to get exchanges to actually deploy this. If somebody's somebody needs to step up to be the first exchange that actually deploys a zero knowledge proof for solvency. And then I think all the other exchanges will do it. So if anybody out there in the audience can help us convince exchanges to actually deploy this, I think this will be wonderful. Just, in the real world, banks have to prove they're solvent, and they do that by auditors. They hire, like, once a year, they hire third-party auditors that's certified that the bank is solvent. In the blockchain, of course, we can do this all using zero knowledge proofs, and so every day you can produce a daily proof that you're solvent, and it would be really cool if
Dan, I can tell you that early on in STRK, this is one of the applications we tried to push forward as a product. And the simple answer and there were some crypto exchanges that really loved it, but they said, look, at the end of the day, I'm going to need to invite this auditor because the regulations ask me for it. And this will just be something supplementary. So, like, yeah, go convince the regulators that this is okay. And, that's like a very long sales cycle. But
yeah. Well, if we don't start at some point, then we'll never get there. So yeah, this is why I'm asking for help from the audience to actually do that. And by the way, in terms of compliance, actually, Bank actually beat me to it. The second application that I really like is exactly what I call zero knowledge taxes. Yeah. So today, when we file our taxes, we have to open up the kimono and show everything about ourselves. It'd be really nice when everything is recorded on a blockchain, we can prove in zero knowledge that we paid the right amount of taxes without revealing our inner workings.
Now, you said three things. So you said
yeah. So the first one was scaling. The second was compliance, and actually the third one is the obvious one, which is privacy. Yeah. So private payments, things like Zcash and so on, are kind of the big three applications. I have to say, by the way, it's very interesting in the area of private payments. I think this is kind of the next big battle. Like, we talk about private communication systems, and as you know, there's often a push towards escrow and backdoors in private communication systems. I think actually private payment systems is kind of another area where there's going to be a lot of tension between governments and privacy advocates, and that's I don't see a lot of discussion of that yet in the mainstream. But this is kind of coming. So there's a very strong parallel between private payments and private communication, and so that's actually going to be something that's going to occupy us this decade. Like, how much privacy should we have in the payment system?
Okay, next question. Native ZK EVM. What are the implications for interoperability, light client security, and composability across rollups and shards?
Oh yeah, so the ZK EVM is I think a remarkable development. This I'm super excited about. So the ZK EVM is basically, for those who are not familiar with it, it's a way to kind of literally take Solidity contracts as is, compile them into EVM bytecode, and then just literally run, and then give proofs that these programs ran correctly, and gives basically proofs in zero knowledge. Obviously the application for this for ZK rollups is enormous, right? You can literally take your Uniswap Solidity code, compile it, and run it on a ZK rollup system. And this is not theory. This has already been done, right? So Uniswap v2 was recently compiled and run on a ZK rollup. So it's really, I have to say, it's like 5 years ago. If you'd asked me, are we ever going to have something like a ZK EVM, I would have said this is science fiction. The prover would just take too long to run. Yeah, and it's a remarkable thing that, first of all, many of the Solidity contracts out there are actually not that complicated. So, the code is not that big. And second of all, with all the advancements in SNARK technology, it's remarkable that we can actually have a ZK EVM. Maybe there's a Cairo version of it. I'll plug Cairo. But which exact version it is I think less important. And what's really remarkable is we will be able to take Solidity contracts, compile them down to whatever intermediate representation, whether it's Yule or whatever, and then produce proofs on that. I honestly, I think this is going to revolutionize the world of blockchains. I'm kind of keep waiting for it to actually gain more traction, and I'm sure like this year we're going to see a lot of deployments in that space. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-boggling that it's doable, and again, I think a huge sign of success for our community.
Next question: what are some undergraduate level topics that you suggest we mere mortals might study What do you say about studying lattice tools?
Oh yeah, I see. Great. Okay, well, should I talk a little bit about what we're working on right now? Maybe that's kind of an area
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think the question was like what undergraduate level topics that might benefit. I guess folks who are not interested necessarily in a PhD in cryptography. What?
Oh, I see.
And that's how I interpret it.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I think.
And then
Actually,
we'll move on and pick up more questions and answer them later.
Sounds great. Yeah. I think there's actually quite a lot of tools that still would be very useful to build. So one of the questions I would like to ask is, for example, suppose you wanted to verify a pairing inside of a zero knowledge proof. Let's say I want to give you a commitment to a BLS signature, and I want to prove to you that what I gave you really is a commitment to a valid signature. That would require you to now run a pairing inside of a zero knowledge proof. So, we don't know how expensive, how practical is this. So it would be, I think this is a nice undergraduate project. Like, could you go ahead and implement Miller's algorithm? You would learn a lot from it into how the thing actually works. Could you implement Miller's algorithm as an R1CS constraint system? Yeah, how would you actually do that efficiently? And then how long does it take the prover to actually run in that case? Yeah, this is a simple, no, not a simple, it's actually a fair amount of work. But I think it's a very educational process. You get to learn about how to encode things as R1CS, how these zero knowledge provers work. You'll get to learn how Miller's algorithm works, and so on. And then the question is basically, how hard is it to verify a pairing inside of a SNARK? And that actually would, if that turns out to be quite realistic, that would actually open the door to lots and lots of different applications, right? So rather than just committing to ECDSA signatures and verifying those, we can now commit to BLS signatures, maybe even aggregate them inside of the commitment, and then prove facts about the aggregates. So that would enable a whole bunch of applications. So I think this is a nice undergraduate project to do.
So maybe this could be a good segue to. Maybe you can survey a little bit your thoughts on like what are your favorite current snarks, thoughts about rollups, and some of your exciting recent works on extending snarks or pairing based techniques to collaborative snarks and functional commitments and things.
Oh yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Thanks, Ellie. So let me talk. So I'd love to talk about things that we're working on now, and maybe then we'll switch to things that hopefully will come in the future. Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about my current work. There are kind of two. Maybe I'll keep it very brief. There are two types of works that I'd like to mention. The first one is actually what we call collaborative proofs. So you all know what a SNARK is, right? A SNARK is a way for a prover who has a witness to prove that the witness satisfies certain properties. But in many situations, the witness is actually not just known to a single prover, but the witness itself is sort of split up into many parts, and different parties know different parts. So the reason we got interested in this actually is because of this question of detecting financial fraud in the financial system. So you can imagine the financial graph where there are nodes in the graph. So nodes correspond to bank accounts. Yeah, so think of all the bank accounts in the world. Every account is a node, and there's an edge between two nodes if there's a transaction, if there's a funds transfer from one account to another account. Yeah. Now, when you come to detect financial fraud, money laundering or other kind of nefarious activities, often these questions turn out to reduce to basically basic questions about this financial graph. Like you ask, is node A connected to node B? Is there a path that connects node A to node B? That often corresponds to some sort of money laundering operation or so. So the problem is that the financial graph is not known to only a single institution, right? There are many banks out there, right? And they all see their view of the graph, but nobody sees the entire view. And in fact, there's no way that the financial institutions in the world will share their customer data with each other because that's very private information. Yeah. And so the financial graph is an example of a witness that sort of splits across many organizations. And yet we'd like to produce a proof that, for example, account A, there's no path from account A to account B. So the two never actually exchange funds with one another. So that's an example of what we call a collaborative proof, right? Where the witness, the data you're proving over is actually shared across many entities. And we'd like to produce a proof that allows these entities to keep their data private, but still the proof becomes available at the end, so that we know that the statement is true. Yeah, and so this is a paper that we recently put on ePrint. So there's kind of a interesting definition of how we define security for collaborative proofs. And then we look for constructions. So the immediate construction that comes to mind is you say, well, why don't we just take the normal SNARK prover and run it in what's called an MPC, in a multi-party computation between the provers who have the components of the witness. Yeah. It turns out if you do that, you're not going to get very far. Yeah, so SNARK provers are already fairly complicated. MPC protocols are fairly complicated. If you try to compose the two, you get this quadratic blow up. So you're not going to get very far. So this is great. I mean, so now the question was, can we come up with a SNARK that's especially well suited for the prover of that SNARK to run in an MPC protocol? Yeah, so that's the question. And so, where do we start? We start by looking at the existing SNARKs. So which can we optimize the existing SNARKs to work with MPC protocols? And the answer is that, if you modify the SNARKs somewhat, then it turns out some of them can be quite MPC friendly. So GROS16, for example, is very MPC friendly. Yeah, if you modify it a little bit, you can actually make it run fairly well inside of an MPC. The next one is Marlin, which could also be modified to run an MPC. Plonk turns out to be a little bit harder because Plonk involves a lot of multiplications. So I thought it was interesting that there's a bit of a difference, not much, but there's a bit of a difference between Marlin and Plonk there in terms of their MPC friendliness. It turns out even Starks can be made to run inside of an MPC quite efficiently. The only issue is if you try to do that, you end up with a Stark proof. When you optimize Starks for MPC, it turns out the Stark proof becomes a little bit bigger than what a single prover Stark proof is. So there's a bit of a cost to running Starks inside of an MPC, but it can be done if you want to. So I thought it was kind of cute that sort of MPC friendliness of the prover is sort of another criteria by which we can compare different SNARK systems. And the goal is basically to come up with a SNARK that's most friendly towards MPC. So this is kind of these experiments are kind of discussed in the paper. And if it's useful for anyone, please get in touch with us. We would love to kind of work with you on more applications of this. That's one. The second example, again, I'll keep it brief because I want to get to the future as well. The second work that I wanted to mention is. If some of you are familiar with the term polynomial commitments, which is how to commit to a polynomial, the second work is how to generalize that to not just committing to polynomials, but committing to functions in general. So what does it mean to commit to a function? Well, what I'd like to do is commit to, I have a function in my head. I'd like to commit to that function. And later on, you can present me with any input x to the function, and I can convince you that f of x is actually, I can give you a value y and convince you that y is equal to f of x, where f is the committed function. Okay, so I'd like to basically open the function to be able to open the committed function at any point that you specify. Yeah, and all that has to be done in zero knowledge, of course. So why would you want to commit to a function? Sort of the application we had in mind was something like computing credit scores, right? So the function that's used to compute credit scores, that generally is a secret function. Yeah, it operates on our private data, but it's a secret function how you go from, our financial data to our credit scores. So when I receive my credit score, so Eli receives his credit score and I receive my credit score, I could wonder, well, how do I know that the same function that was used to compute Eli's score was the same function that was used to compute my score? Yeah, maybe somehow the bank is discriminating and using one function for Eli and a different function for me. So with functional commitments, what we can do is the bank can commit to the credit score function, and then it could prove that basically the same function is being applied to the entire population. It's not one function per user, but everybody is subject to the same function. And moreover, you can even have an auditor look at the function and certify, yes, this function actually is fair. It doesn't have an if statement that says if user equals Eli, give maximum value. If user equals then, give minimum value. Yeah, so the auditor would certify that this is actually a fair function by whatever definition of fairness you want. And then once that certification is verified, then we're guaranteed that the same function is applied everywhere. And so again, the question is, how do we build efficient commitment schemes? And it turns out pre-processing SNARKs, what are called universal pre-processing SNARKs, are a good place to start. But it turns out to be a pretty difficult question. And the problem is basically, how do we know that the thing that the bank committed to is actually a well-formed function? Maybe the circuit that they're committing to, maybe it has hidden inputs that nobody knows about. Maybe the circuit that they're committing to has loops, right? Circuits are supposed to be acyclic graphs, but maybe the circuit has loops in it, and the function is kind of malformed as a result. And it turns out bad things can happen if that's the case. So really kind of our focus was, it turned out the hard part of this work was basically, how do we prove that a committed circuit actually efficiently? How do we prove that a committed circuit doesn't have any hidden inputs, doesn't have any loops, and so on? So that's kind of turned out to be kind of interesting techniques for proving properties of polynomials. Again, this is, if anyone is interested, that's kind of on ePrint. If you have application, if this is something that's applicable to you, again, please reach out, and we'd love to work with you.
I'm curious on this last thing, like, because for instance, the way right now the Cairo verifier works on chain is that it basically receives as a statement a hash of the program. So can you have let's say the government or the tax authority, the credit score authority commit to a program and then basically prove that it ran that program on various inputs?
Oh, that's exactly what it does. That's exactly what it does.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And the question then is, how do you prove that the program that was committed to is a well-formed program? It's not something that's actually not a function.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very
so one thing that's, maybe I'll say one sentence there, is like, you can imagine committing to an R1CS program, but you have to prove that this R1CS program is well defined. For every input, there's a unique output. And it turns out there's like a nice linear algebra characterization for when is an R1CS program when does it define a well-defined function. It turns out it has to do with the matrices being diagonal or triangular. And then the question is, how do you prove that a committed matrix is in fact diagonal or triangular? And that's kind of where the work was. Yeah, so it's kind of fun to do. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say, this is work with my students, Alex Ozdemir and Wilson Nguyen, who are fantastic students. So I'm blessed to have really good students.
Okay, a few questions. So first one, is post-quantum, PQ, generating any discussion within the SNARK community?
Yeah, very much so. Right. So, maybe I'll take this. I don't know. Well, there's a lot more things I want to talk about. But we're kind of running short on time. So do
you want to go ahead and not, or just leave this question and talk about other things?
Well, actually, maybe I'll take this question as an opportunity to talk about the one thing that I wanted to get across in the post-quantum world. Yeah. So definitely, post-quantum is it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's a very, very important issue. There is one question that I feel like we, the crypto community, have failed the blockchain community, and that is this question of good post-quantum signatures. Yeah, just simple digital signatures that are post-quantum secure. So if you look at the NIST post-quantum signatures, the NIST approved 3 post-quantum signatures: Dilithium, Falcon, and Rainbow. Yeah, those are the 3 NIST post-quantum signatures. If you look at the length of the signatures that they generate, by the way, it's not just a signature that needs to be short. What we want is that the signature and the public key together, the pair, should be short. If you look at those 3 candidates, they generate fairly long signatures. Again, signature public key pairs. So when I say long, I mean they're like an order of a kilobyte, even for the level 1 security, lowest level of post-quantum security. The signatures, for Rainbow, for example, the public key is huge. For Dilithium, the signatures, maybe Falcon is a good example. For Falcon, the signatures are about 900 bytes, and the public key is 900 bytes. The signature is about 700 bytes. This is much, much worse than Schnorr signatures, right? Schnorr signatures, the public key is like 32 bytes. The signature is like 64 bytes. or maybe 48 bytes, and that's it. So these post-quantum signatures are much, much worse than what we have in the pre-quantum world. And so I think this is a really important challenge for all of us. Can we come up with post-quantum signatures that are as short as Schnorr signatures? Yeah, they should be competitive with the length of Schnorr signatures. Of course, signing and verification should have comparable times as well. And honestly, I have to say, for a long time, I thought isogeny-based systems would be kind of the way to go. But now I'm not so convinced. Maybe I'll say there's one system that I'd like to mention. It's a system by Leo Ducas and W. Sorry, I'm blanking on the name. Apologies. The system name is called SQI sign. SQI sign, and that actually generates.
Wicks, by any chance? Daniel Wicks, maybe?
No, not Daniel Wicks.
Okay. I exhausted my W's for cryptographers.
Okay, no. Sorry, oh man, this is embarrassing. Apologies, but sometimes this happens. Anyhow, the signature in SQI sign is something like 200 bytes. Yeah, so it's it's getting there. Thank you, Vasilowski. Thank you very much, Benjamin Vasilowski. Sorry, Benjamin. Yes, Benjamin Vasilowski. Thank you so much, Frederick. Yes, excellent. So SQI sign, basically the signature is 204 bytes, again, for the lowest level of NIST security. So we're getting there, but 200 bytes is still not 48 or 64 bytes. Yeah, so we're still a factor of 4 away, and this is a really wonderful open problem that I hope folks can work on. Yeah, it's a really, really, really interesting question, and so I would really encourage all of you to kind of help us solve this. Yeah, so I think that's what I'll say in the post-quantum space.
Sorry, I keep changing the screens because I'm not very proficient with this technology. Okay, but can you? So all the focus and all the rave now is on snarks and starks and ZKPs and proofs of integrity, but right, the field of cryptography, even though some think it was only invented in 2009, has a lot more in terms of new interesting primitives to offer. So can you survey what are the things that someday will impact all of our lives in blockchain, and how, and we're not aware of them yet?
Yeah, actually, I would love to. So, and again, I'll try to keep it brief because we're running short on time. But it's you have to remember. I mean, snarks were like one primitive developed in the world of crypto that turned out to be extremely useful in the world of blockchains. But there are many other primitives that are useful in crypto that for sure are going to have applications to blockchains. So maybe I'll just mention 2. So the 2 that I really like, although there's a lot more research to do here. The first one I'll mention is obfuscation. Yeah, so cryptographic obfuscation. This sometimes goes by the name of IO obfuscation, indistinguishability obfuscation, IO. And so the reason obfuscation is so relevant to blockchains is that it allows us. It basically solves a problem that we can't solve today. The problem is, how do we keep secrets on the chain? Suppose I have to put a cryptographic key on the chain. How do we do that in a way that's efficient? So you might ask, well, why do I want to keep a cryptographic key on the chain? You can imagine, if you want to build a bridge that goes, from Ethereum to Bitcoin, right? So the bridge has to release funds on the Bitcoin side using a cryptographic key that would live on the Ethereum side. So the Ethereum contract would have to sign a Bitcoin transaction. That would mean that a Bitcoin secret key has to live on the Ethereum blockchain, but then everybody can read it. Yeah, which is a problem. If we had obfuscation, we could actually write an obfuscated Solidity contract that would live on the Ethereum chain. It would hold the cryptographic key, but it would only use it if the correct events happened that meant that a Bitcoin transaction needs to be issued. Yeah, and so obfuscation is if we could have efficient obfuscation, it would be a pretty useful tool for keeping secret keys on a blockchain and making those secret keys only work when they're supposed to work. So instead, today, of course, we have to rely on trusted parties to keep those keys secret. It'd be nicer to do it without. So you should ask me, well, what's the stumbling block to get obfuscation? Why can't we get obfuscation to run on the blockchain today? And the answer is the best constructions for obfuscation rely on multilinear maps. So if we had good multilinear maps, we would have good obfuscation systems, and we could run them on a blockchain. Yeah. So this is kind of another, for the mathematicians in the audience, this is kind of another reason to develop good cryptographic multilinear maps. So that's one example that I wanted to mention. I think obfuscation is a really cool cryptographic primitive. If we had a good implementation of it, it would be really useful in the blockchain space. The other one that I wanted to mention is what's called witness encryption. So witness encryption is again a really cool primitive. It was first defined by Brent Waters and Amit Sahai. So what witness encryption lets you do, in its simplest form, it lets you, for example, encrypt to a 3-colorable graph. Yeah. So imagine I have a graph. I don't know the coloring of I don't know a coloring of this graph, but I can encrypt this graph in such a way that anyone who has the coloring can decrypt. Yeah, so I can, it's a little weird. I can encrypt to sort of a problem that I don't know the solution to, but if somebody has a solution, they can decrypt what I encrypted. Yeah, so that's called witness encryption. If you have a witness, you can decrypt. If you don't have a witness, you can't decrypt, but anyone can encrypt to this problem. Yeah, so witness encryption is kind of an interesting concept. Now, the reason why is this useful in the world of blockchains? Well, it allows us to do basically sort of very easy to use time lock systems. So imagine I want to post something today that is in the clear, but I want to hide my identity. So I want to encrypt my identity so that maybe my identity will be revealed only in 20 years, right? So I post some piece of data, but only in 20 years, people will know that it's me who did it. So there's something called time lock cryptography, which I can encrypt to something that will only become available 20 years from now. But somebody will have to run a machine for 20 years so that in 20 years they'll be able to decrypt what I wrote. So that's not really practical. That's not really happening. And that who's going to run a machine for 20 years? But we already have a clock. We already built a clock that could function in this way, and that's called the Bitcoin blockchain. Right? It has a clock, or actually any proof of work blockchain. It has a clock built in, such that in 20 years we'll know that block number such and such will be computed. And what we can do is we can kind of use witness encryption to encrypt to a block that's 20 years in the future. Yeah, and the witness will be sort of a hash pre-image that will satisfy all the blocks from 20 years from now all the way up until now. And if you have that witness, you can decrypt. Otherwise, you can't decrypt. Yeah, so in some sense, we're guaranteed that the Bitcoin blockchain basically will allow us to decrypt something in 20 years, but we will not be able to decrypt before. And again, the cryptographic mechanism that makes this possible is called witness encryption. And again, we would love to have good witness encryption. What's the stumbling block? Why can't we have efficient witness encryption today? And the answer is multilinear maps. If we had good multilinear maps, we would have good witness encryption. So all these kind of magical applications would become a lot better once somebody finally constructs good multilinear maps. So
I'm curious, before we get to the questions, if you had to make a bet on what's the next, sophisticated, not in use crypto primitive that will enter production.
No, I think
what would you bet on?
Well, okay. So multi-party computation is not as widely used today as SNARKs, for example. I would guess that multi-party computation is the next thing that's going to have much wider use.
Not FHE
or
obfuscation.
It's interesting. I mean, there's this concept called confidential computing, which is how do we compute on data without actually revealing what the data is? And there are 3 approaches to confidential computing, right? MPC, FHE, fully homomorphic encryption, and hardware, enclave-based approaches, right? Those are 3 approaches to confidential computing. They have very similar characteristics. Well, I mean, they have different security assumptions, but they kind of solve similar problems. And so, yeah, I think that actually is something that confidential computing is something that we're going to see quite a lot of use of in the future. And which of these 3 will win? Time will tell.
Well, enclaves are around. Whether they work or not is
that's the question. Yeah,
debate, but
whether we trust them or not. Yeah.
So, would you like to take a few questions, or do you want to?
I would love to. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so do you want?
Wait. There's a question here in the chat. There's a question here in the chat about 2 years ago we released our version 0.5 of our book. So 0.5 is out, and in fact we're about to release 0.6. Hopefully it'll be released in February, and it's going to have a lot more material in it. There's 3 new chapters on multi-party computations and attack, and so 0.6 is coming.
Okay, so I think you answered this question: is post-quantum PQ generating discussion within the SNARK community? Okay, seeing how ZK proofs enabled rollups and a lot of different privacy-preserving technologies, do you predict similar impact of having viable methods for cryptographic obfuscation?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned what the holdup is. We're kind of all waiting for better multilinear maps. There's a lot of theoretical progress on obfuscation, but we're not anywhere near practicality yet. So this is probably one of those things that we're going to just have to wait a few more years until the crypto community improves things. You have to remember the state of zero knowledge in the early 2000s was considered a completely theoretical concept, right? Eli, you remember this, right? When you were when you were starting in this area, it was a completely theoretical concept. Who cares about zero knowledge, right? And then enough ideas came along to make it very practical that now we have a ZK EVM, which is again mind-boggling that we can do it.
Okay. Next question. Are there branches of cryptography which are not based on algebra, but rather on, say, analysis or non-algebraic geometry?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. So, lattices, of course, are based on, I don't know if you want to call lattices algebra or not. Lattices are very geometric objects. So that's a pretty developed area of cryptography. Honestly, cryptography is one of these strange areas where we are always looking for hard problems, right? So we love it when you give us most of computer science hates it when you give them a hard problem. We like computationally difficult problem. We like computational difficult problems, and they're everywhere, right? So group theory has a lot of computationally difficult problems. I think there's a lot of room for building crypto from hard problems in group theory. For non-algebraic, the problem is we need structure, right? I mean, to build public key systems, you need additional structure, and that usually comes from algebra. This is why so much of the work in crypto tends to be algebraic. And so, maybe I'll just leave it at that. But if somebody has new ideas for hard problems for which we can build crypto, go ahead and publish them.
I want to give my answer to that, which is the only 2 things I ever saw in math can be there are 2 things mathematicians I've seen can do. And only 2 things. It's count and do Gaussian elimination. So almost everything, if you unfold it and see what goes on, there's some counting and some linear algebra of finding a basis or reducing something. So it just seems that we or math is somewhat limited in what you can do. This is okay. When cryptography 2 on Coursera?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. A lot of people ask me that. Honestly, so cryptography 1, of course, has been live and launched for many years. My plan for cryptography 2, honestly, is to launch it once the book is finished. Yeah, so we're getting very close. So I promise it'll come out. It'll happen. It'll come out. So hopefully it's another year until the book is finished, and then maybe 6 months after the cryptography 2 will launch. These things are. These MOOCs actually are a fair amount of work to put together, and I want to make sure that there's a textbook that goes with the MOOC when it's available. So it'll happen.
Okay, you have it on record now.
Yes.
Okay, next question. In which years have been mathematicians, I guess, most successful in making progress? What are the years? What are the golden years of mathematics? Maybe mathematics related to this particular field of cryptography or pairing-based or elliptic curve cryptography?
Oh, I see. Boy, that's a tough question. Well, I think there's in the world of crypto, there's constant progress, right? This is never a boring field. There's always, every year, there's new results, and kind of either new primitives are proposed and new schemes are discovered, or new attacks are discovered, and so on. So there's every year there seems to be new things happening. I can't say that there's one year that's like more exciting than
I
others.
tend to agree, and I would just say that, like, if you look at, let's say, physics, so everyone recognizes, Newtonian era, and then maybe quantum mechanics. You need at least a century to look back and say, there were like these 20, 30 years. And this whole field of cryptography is too young to say, those were the 10 or 20 years that really made a difference, and the rest didn't. So it's still going.
Yeah, it's good to remember, actually, the Diffie-Hellman paper that started modern cryptography is 1976, right?
Yeah.
It's not even 50 years.
Yeah.
And you can look at how much the field has progressed in those 50 years. It's really quite amazing.
Yeah. Okay, next question. You have done some foundational work on VDFs, verifiable delay functions. What's your feeling about the status of current work in that area? Most exciting current applications, realizations, areas that are undervalued?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So, right. What's the most? Well, VDFs are kind of now. What can I say? So, verifiable delay functions, we have, good instantiations of them. There's actually, by the way, there's a new concept called verifiable, called delayed encryption. So, if folks are interested in seeing kind of where the VDF space is going, go ahead and take a look at the delayed encryption papers. There are interesting constructions for those. There's still, what can I say? Some of the open problems are actually getting solved. Like, one of the open problems was, can we build a VDF where the proof that the VDF was evaluated correctly, the proof is empty? It's kind of the value of the VDF is sort of self-evident that it was computed correctly. There's a very recent proposal for actually doing that. It's not the perfect solution, just because it takes a lot of work to now set up the VDF system every time. So there's probably more work to do on that front. VDFs are kind of it's a good tool for consensus. I was happy to see that Solana, for example, uses. I mean, they have their own version of a VDF, but that concept is kind of powering Solana. So that was really great to see. And I'm looking forward to seeing what's going to happen next with VDFs.
Oh, this is a very nice question. As cryptography, and by extension, cryptographers, become increasingly powerful, should the paper entitled "The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work" be mandatory reading on undergraduate courses?
My God, that is a great question. I actually have strong feelings about this, in that, it's really interesting that cryptography is no longer just math. Yeah, cryptography actually affects people's lives. Now it affects real money, right? So there's a lot to cryptography now, more than just math. And I can tell you, actually, for the last couple of years, in my cryptography class on campus at Stanford, DS255 class, the last lecture in our class is, I always invite Jennifer Granick from the ACLU to speak about the sort of the moral applications of cryptography. So I would encourage, actually, anyone who's teaching a crypto class, for the last lecture, or at any point during the course, I think it's really important to devote one lecture to sort of the moral aspects of cryptography. Yeah, but I mean, how is cryptography used in the real world? What are the debates that are happening around backdooring cryptography? This is kind of this is more than just math now. It's really quite important to get this right. And actually, when you write cryptography software, it's also very important to think a little bit about how it's going to get used, and whether what are the impacts that it's going to have on people's lives. So yeah, it's a great question, and I very much agree with the question.
Maybe let's take just one last question, and then but there are actually a lot more, and okay. So per your opening anecdote, when someone it's okay, we'll take this one and another one. When someone says crypto for cryptocurrency, how much do you die inside?
Right. I don't really. I've come to terms with it. That doesn't really bother me so much. So you're saying, like, crypto used to mean cryptography. Now, what happened is, in my daily conversations now, I use the word cryptocurrencies or cryptography. So crypto now is an ambiguous term, because when you say crypto, people don't really know what you mean. And so maybe we just need to get more used to saying cryptography and cryptocurrencies, or I would prefer to just refer to that space as blockchains rather than cryptocurrencies. And so we can have our crypto term back. But yeah, I've come to terms with this.
Here's another cool question, and then we'll take one more, okay? What is the difficulty of making a practical multilinear map? Or how long would somebody have to serve in prison to find it?
Right. By now we've been searching for one for a long time. Not just when I say we, I mean a big chunk of the mathematics community. We've had workshops on multilinear maps. We even had a whole NSF program on it, and it's hard. What can I tell you? It's like everything we the mathematics community have been able to do is provide proofs that certain directions are not going to work. Yeah. So it's gonna take some new idea. This is not an easy problem. There's a real difference between a bilinear map and a trilinear map. Yeah. So we're gonna need some new idea. Hopefully nobody has to go to prison for it.
2 is a magical number. Okay, last question, promise. Which current blockchain tech is likely to become obsolete due to cryptographic advances?
Oh my God.
Hopefully proof of work. Not that I see exactly how, but with all the with all the carbon emissions.
Yeah. What can I say? It will be nice when at least one of the naysayer arguments is that blockchains are polluting. I think it would be nice when we take away that argument from the naysayers. So I'm hopeful. Maybe this is a bit of a tricky question. Maybe I'll leave it at that. I think it will be the more we can do to kind of make blockchains easier for people to understand and appreciate, the better off everybody is. So hopefully things are going to go in that direction.
Okay, so we went over time. There's still a few more questions. I apologize to those that we haven't had the time to answer. Professor Dan Bonnet of Stanford University. It's been a great honor and a lot of fun, and I personally learned a lot from this. And thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellie, and thanks for all the questions. And I'm glad to see people stayed on. So goodbye, everyone.
Bye.